Hey, what's going on, everybody? Hello, good afternoon, good afternoon. What's happening? This your girl Tiffany coming through here live in effect on this beautiful Thursday of November the 10th of 2022. So today's subject is going to be about Malcolm X on Afro-American history and Dwight Lowell Dumond's book, which is called Anti-Slavery. So real quick, before I get started, I just want to thank those who have been subscribed to my channel, liking my channel, share my channel, and make sure you guys check out all the other contents on here, okay? So I just want to thanks to all my subscribers that's on here and that has been supporting me. Appreciate you. So now let me go ahead and get started. So Malcolm was pretty before he was ahead of his time. And the reason why I say he was ahead of his time was because right after he left the Nation of Islam, right after he left the Nation of Islam, he began his organization called the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And with that being said, he was doing a lot of rallying and speeches, right? And so most of his speeches under that organization was pertaining to Afro-American history. And I have the book right here. Okay, so I recommend people get this book. Malcolm was pretty much ahead. He was ahead of a lot of people. If Malcolm was still alive today, he would have became a historian because he knew so much information. Now, some of the information might be inaccurate, but most of it was on point for the most part. So in this book here, it contains with a lot of his speeches, a lot of excerpt, and then some of come from his autobiography. So I just want to give an example, right? So let's just go into the selection, right, where it says how Malcolm X studied Afro-American history. The selection came from the autobiography of Malcolm X on page 81. All right, so let's see. So on page 81, Malcolm talks about how he studied Afro-American history. Now, he was already knowing about African-American history, right? You know, in African history, he was familiarized with it before he started joining the Nation of Islam. And this was during the time that he was incarcerated in prison before he got out. So it says in this book, Norfolk Prison Colony's library was one of its outstanding features. A millionaire named Barkhurst had willed his library there. He had probably been interested in the rehabilitation program. History and religions were his special interests. Thousands of his books were on the shelves, and in the back were boxes and crates full, for which there wasn't space for the shelves. At Norfolk, we could actually go into the library with permission, walk up and down the shelves and pick books. There were hundreds of old volumes, some of them probably quite rare. I aimlessly until I learned to read selectively with a purpose. Then he go on to mention, he said, I can remember accurately at the very first set of books that really impressed me. I have since bought that set of books and I have it at home for my children to read as they grow up. It's called Wonders of the World. It's full of pictures of archaeological finds, statues that depict usually non-European people. I found books like William Durant's Story of Civilization. I read H.G. Wells' Outline of History, Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois, gave me a glimpse into the Black people's history before they came to this country. Carter G. Woodson's Negro History opened my eyes about Black empires before the Black slave was brought to the United States and the early Negro struggles for freedom. All right, so these were the books that Malcolm was exposed to, he was reading at the time. But he also goes on to talk about J.A. Rogers' 3 volumes of Sex and Race, told about race missing before Christ's time, about Aesop being a Black man who told fables about Egypt's pharaohs, about the great Coptic Christian empires, about Ethiopia, the Earth's old continuous black civilization, as China is the oldest continuous as China is the oldest continuous civilization. Then he goes on to say that I will never forget how shocked I was when I began reading about slavery's total horror. It made such an impact upon me that it later became one of my favorite subjects when I became a minister of Mr. Muhammad's. The world's most monstrous crime, the sin and the blood on the white man's hand, are almost impossible to believe. Books like the one by Frederick Olmsted opened my eyes to horror suffered when the slave was landed in the United States. The European woman, Fanny Kimball, who had married a southern white slave owner, described how humans were degraded. Of course, I read Uncle Tom's Cabin. In fact, I believe that's the only novel I have ever read since I started serious reading. Parkhurst's collection also contains some bound pamphlets of abolitionist anti-slavery society of New England. I read description of atrocities, saw those illustrations of black slave women tied up and flogged with whips, of black mothers watching their babies being dragged off, never to be seen by their mothers again, of dogs after slaves, of the fugitive slave catchers, evil white men with whips and clubs and chains and guns. I read about the slave preacher Nat Turner, who put the fear of God into white slave masters. Nat Turner wasn't going around preaching pie in the sky and nonviolent freedom for the black man. There in Virginia, one night in 1831, Nat and 7 other slaves started out at his master's home, and through the night they went from one plantation, big house, to the next, killing until by the next morning 57 white people were dead, and Nat had about 70 slaves following him. White people, terrified for their lives, fled from their homes, locked themselves up in public buildings, hid in the woods, and some even left the state. A small army of soldiers took 2 months to catch and hang Nat Turner. Somewhere I have read where Nat Turner's example is said to have inspired John Brown to invade Virginia and attack Harper's Ferry nearly 30 years later with 13 white men and 5 Negroes. All right, and so he was reading all of this while he was in prison. So he already knew about African history. He was well versed in it. Okay, but he started off with the Nation of Islam because that was his opportunity. That was his platform. And Elijah Muhammad was going to be the one to give him that opportunity to be able to have a voice for the people. So he became the voice for the people, and he became the minister. All right. So he was the main reason why there a lot of people became members of the nation. So the membership was growing because of Malcolm, because of the fact that he was a very eloquent speaker. He was a powerful man. For somebody who don't have a high school education and who barely knew how to read, he taught himself a lot. Okay. So with that being said, let's go on to the next one. So this book is, like I say, is dealing with a lot of his speeches and some excerpt from his autobiography, and also some of the excerpt from his autobiography and his speeches in this book. So that's what this book is about, and that's what it's really dealing with. So I mean, of course, some of the stuff sound familiar to us, like in here he talks about the house Negro and the field Negro in this book. Okay, so, and we're familiar with the concept about the field Negro and the house Negro. Of course, most of us are, because he has a speech on that, and you can go check out the speech. And also he got the speech about Afro-American history. But let's go to the part about the missing 75 million. So 100 million Africans were uprooted from the African continent. Where are they today? 100 million Africans were uprooted. 100 million Africans, according to the book Anti-Slavery by Professor Dwight Lowell Dumond, excuse me for raising my voice, were uprooted from the continent of Africa. At the end of slavery, you didn't have 25 million Africans in the Western Hemisphere. What happened to those 75 millions? their bodies are at the bottom of the ocean, or their blood and their bones have fertilized the soil of this country. So he said at the end of slavery, you didn't have 25 million Africans in the Western Hemisphere. So what happened to the 75 million? Now, some of y'all might think that, well, the number might be inaccurate. And they didn't really know how many at that time period, but it was a lot of slaves. Okay, now some of them was sent out to other countries. They were sent out to South America, Latin America, in the Caribbeans. And those were sent here to America, right? And there were those who died along the way while they was coming here. So what I want to do is I'm going to go back and show you guys what is the organization Afro-American Unity, for those who may not be familiar with it. Then I want to talk about Dwight, Lowell, Dumond. Okay. All right, so Organization Afro-American Unity. The Organization Afro-American Unity was a Pan-African organization founded by Malcolm X in 1964. So the OAAU was modeled on the Organization African Unity, which had impressed Malcolm X during his visit to Africa in April and May of 1964. The purpose of the Organization Afro-American Unity was to fight for the human rights of African Americans and promote cooperation among Africans and people of African descent in the Americas. All right, so that was the whole purpose. So basically, it was the purpose to fight for the rights of the blacks in America and the blacks in the diaspora, the other part of the diaspora, and also the blacks in the continent. So Malcolm has visited Africa, right? And he went over there, he met Kwame Nkrumah. Okay, so what many of us don't know is that Malcolm did a lot of travel to Africa, and along with going to Mecca. He traveled to places like Egypt. He traveled to places like Ghana. He met with leaders. But see, this is the other part of the history that many of us are not aware about Malcolm. So when we hear about Malcolm X, all we really know is someone that was in the Nation of Islam, someone that was a minister, that had a powerful voice, but nobody knew exactly what he was doing outside of the nation once he left. Nobody really know that he was actually well-versed in study into Afro-American history and African history. And as I mentioned before, he would have made a great historian if he was alive today. So who is Dwight Lowell? So let's go ahead and get into his biography. So the author that Malcolm was mentioning, right? Dwight Lowell Dumond. Right here. So he was an American academic and writer known for his work on slavery. He served as professor emeritus of American history at the University of Michigan. So Dumond was born in Kingston, Ohio on August 27, 1895. He completed his undergraduate studies at Baldwin Wallace University in 1920 and graduated from Washington University with a master's degree in 1925. So in 1929, he completed a PhD at the University of Michigan. He taught history at Ohio Wesleyan University for 1 year before moving to the University of Michigan, where he taught from 1930 to 1965. And after his retirement from Michigan, he taught at Howard University and Colgate University. He won an Ansfield Wolf Book Award for his book Anti-Slavery in 1961, and was awarded an honorary doctorate from Northern Michigan University in 1965. The University of Michigan has a collection of his paper. All right, so he and Gilbert H. Barnes were credited by Merton L. Dillon with reappraising the causes of American Civil War. So these are the list of books that he has written: The Secession Movement, Letters of Theodore Dwight Weld, Angela Gimmick Weld, and Sarah Gimmick, Roosevelt to Roosevelt, Anti-Slavery Origin of the Civil War in the United States, A History of the United States, America in Our Time, Black Mother, The Years of the African Slave Trade, Anti-Slavery Crusade for Freedom in America, A Bibliography of Anti-Slavery in America, and America's Shame and Redemption in 1965. So he passed away on May 30th of 1976. Okay. Now, I don't have any pictures of him. I tried to look for pictures on the internet, so I don't have any pictures, but that's like basically the only information I can pull up as far as his biography is concerned. All right. So let's go ahead and get into the book that Malcolm was talking about. Now, you guys can check it out on archive.org. Right here on archive.org. You guys can check this book out for yourself. It'll let you borrow for an hour. It may let you borrow for... it'll let you borrow for an hour for 14 days. So it's like an online library collection book, basically. So think about going to the library, but you're doing it online. That's basically what archive.org is. All right, so let's go on to... So let's go to the title of the book. The book was called Anti-Slavery, The Crusade for Freedom in America. And at that time, the book only cost $2.25 during that time period. All right, so now let's go down to the table of contents. So chapter 1 deals with the perpetual servitude. Chapter 2 deals with the foundation of freedom. Chapter 3 deals with the impact of the revolution. Chapter 4 deals with slavery and the Constitution. Chapter 5 deals with gradual emancipation. Chapter 6 deals with national policy. Chapter 7 deals with slavery and anti-political power. Chapter 8 deals with foreign slave trade. And then go all the way down, kind of skip down a little bit. James Gillespie Birney, civil rights. The Prudence Crandall case, the lynch law, the higher law. And then when you go all the way down further, you'll see where it says the churches, labor, free soil, the road to freedom. So now what I want to do is I want to look at chapter 2 where it says the foundation of freedom. So that starts on page 16. All right, so foundations of freedom. So it says there was no anti-slavery society and no anti-slavery newspaper or magazine before the revolution. There was little of any sort of print anti-slavery material except occasional exposition, sermons, and remonstrance published and privately distributed to small and select numbers of people until the very eve of the revolution. So neither were their established system of recording and reporting court decision or debates in colonial assemblies. So that taken in its entirety, the period offers little to the historian in the way of documentary information, it offered less to the average citizen of that time in the way of enlightenment, intellectual stimulation, or persuasion. The man who opposed slavery did so not because he had read a book or newspaper or otherwise digest an argument, but because he instinctively rejected a system of human relationships so early foreign to common decency. And said Roger Williams obviously was one of these people, and so was Chief Justice Samuel Sewall, whose The Selling of Joseph was long thought to have been the first published argument against slavery in America. Nobody seems to have taken either one of them very seriously, but Sewall did state the first major indictment of slavery, one that was to be repeated 1,000 times in every conceivable type of literature. The separation of men and women from their homeland, of husbands from wives, and of parents from children, and he touched lightly upon the evil effects of slavery upon the character of slaveholders. So now, according to Dr. Dumond, he was basically saying that one of the accounts about slavery during the earliest period was written by Roger Williams and Chief Justice Samuel Sewall in the book called The Selling of Joseph. All right. So what he was saying that there was no newspaper at the time before the revolution about anti-slavery. Okay. Then he goes on to say that Sewall was a Puritan, and the Puritans were not the pioneers in the anti-slavery movement. That honor belongs to the Quakers, for the Quakers were gentle people living by the precept of golden rule, believing in the inherent dignity of man, the freedom of human will, and the equality of all men. They owned slaves in the 17th century and a part of the 18th, but George Fox sounded a warning against it in 1657. Thomas Drake says in this, his first discussion of slavery he made only a beginning. He did not condemn slaveholding as such, but he did expound the ideal of the equality of men in the eyes of God, and this ideal touchstones to the truth finally, more than a century later, freed the Quaker slaves. So it says the Quakers experienced great difficulty from the beginning for defense of slavery by the suppression of freedom of inquiry, suppression of freedom of inquiry and discussion and other slave rights, and by the use of charges of let me zoom this up. Okay. Let me go back. All right. So other civil rights, and by the use of charges of incendiarism and of foul invective to discredit the friend of the slave, did not originate in the American South, though it reached optimum heights there, nor did it develop in response to the violent language of abolitionists as has been claimed. It came out of the practice of slaveholding, the relationship between master and slave, the intoxication of unrestrained power, and the habit of destroying all opposition to the master's will. Furthermore, these early Quakers were not an obnoxious group of meddlers talking of things they knew not of, any more than were the later anti-slavery leaders of the 19th century, as was charged and commonly believed then and now. They were slaveholders, rich and powerful slaveholders in every part of British colonial America, just as were many of the just as many of the later anti-slavery leaders. So these Quaker abhorred all violence. They never spoke in harsh language. They opposed slavery from first to last on moral and religious ground as a sin. They made tremendous financial sacrifices to rid themselves of the contamination. They never asked anything for themselves by the way of profit, political, social, or economic from their friendship for the oppressed. Nevertheless, they were vilely denounced, charged with inciting rebellion, suppressed, and finally driven out of Barbados because they sought to Christianize and educate their slaves. They were denied the poor privilege of freeing their slaves in the southern states, and in the early Congress of the United States were accused of treason and incendiarism because they petitioned for the suppression of the African slave trade. So basically, out of all the other Christian groups, the Quakers themselves were against slavery. They felt like it was a sin to have these people in bondage. So whereas the other white counterparts that came from other Christian denomination, particularly, they felt like the Quakers were traitors. And they felt like the Quakers were turning on the rest of the white population. So they looked at them as a problem. Now, what's very interesting is when we go back and study about the history of some of the HBCUs, not all of them, but some of the HBCUs were founded by those who were Quakers and anti-slave abolitionists. All right. So we know that most of the HBCUs were founded by Black people that was at the AME churches, right? But some of them were Quakers. Yeah, some of the HBCUs were founded by white people who were Quakers. And Quaker is the Christian denomination group. Now, today, they're not very popular. They're not very popular today. So you don't hear much about the Quakers today, but back then they were a very strong Christian nation. Then, they was one of the most popular denomination during slavery time. But today you don't hear much about the Quakers. So when you hear about the Christian denomination, you mostly hear about the Baptists. You hear about the what you call them, the Apostolics and the Methodists. That's who you mostly hear about today when it comes to the most popular denomination, and Catholics, of course. But everybody else, they're not as popular. So like the Quaker, the Protestant, the Sebastians, you don't hear much about them. The Puritans, you're not going to hear anything about them today. Lutherans, they're not very popular in today's time. Now, speaking of Quaker, there was a Black Quaker who founded a HBCU. If I could pull up his name. So that Black Quaker name was Richard Humphrey. So Richard Humphrey founded what's today known as Shawnee University in Shawnee, Pennsylvania. So he founded that school, right? So let's go real quick. So I don't want to put too much focus on him, but I just want to show real fast. He was one of the Quakers. Check this out. So Richard Humphrey was a silversmith who founded a school for African Americans in Philadelphia. Originally called the African Institution or African Institute, it was renamed the Institute for Colored Youth and eventually became Shawnee University of Pennsylvania, the oldest historically Black college in the United States. So Humphreys was a Quaker philanthropist who bequeathed $10,000, 1/10 of his estate, to establish a school for the descendant of the African race. So this Institute for Colored Youth, later renamed the Shawnee University, was founded in 1837 to provide institutional opportunities for African American. Humphreys changed his will to include this bequest in 1829 after race riots occurred in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Cincinnati riots of 1829. So the second bequest is of $10,000 for the purpose of founding an institution for the education of the descendant of the African race. He left small legacies to a shelter for colored orphans and to 3 city dispensaries. So basically Richard Humphrey was one of those. So he was one of those Africans that was a Quaker, and he started Shannon University, which was actually called the African Institute for the African Race of People. Now, this is the education for the ADOS and the FBAs, all right? Here it is, a black man. When he opened up the HBCU, he didn't say that, well, this is just going to be for the descendant of slaves here in America, and it's not going to be for anybody else. No, his attitude was, we're going to open up the school for African Americans, or African people, period, African descendants, period. And that's what he focused on. And again, this came from the black man named Richard Humphreys, who was a Quaker. All right, so yeah, there were black people who joined the Quaker movement because the Quakers were very gentle and they were very kind-hearted and respectful to them. And they did not look at them like less of human beings. So, and they fought in the abolitionist movement. All right. So let's go back to the book, Anti-Slavery. Hold on. No. All right, so let's check out some more information from this book. All right, so let's go down to slavery and political power. So that's page 63. So right here it says, year by year, slavery in the United States became more sinister. It contaminated the body politic. It exerted an evil influence in all institutional life. It was inherently aggressive. It was a verifiable colossus of greed and arbitrary power by 1793. The steps by which it had reached its exalted position are very clear. The denial of emancipation by conversion to Christianity had shifted the basis of slavery from hedonism to race. The consequences were frightful. It unloosened on Africa for a generation a terror unequal in human history, a terror that did not cease until 100 million human beings perished. It introduced race prejudice into America. Race prejudice was hostile to democratic institutions, and it was 100 times more difficult to destroy than was slavery. It caused the churches of the Lower South to become bulwarks of slavery. Does that sound familiar? Because today, going back to what he stated, that it was 100 times more difficult to destroy than was slavery. So to this day, there's still racism, and racism is still at effect. So it's difficult to get rid of the concept of racism. Why? Because it's still built on that principle. It's still built on that foundation. So America was built on the foundation of not only slavery, but also racism. So racism is not going anywhere out the picture. So some people may be oblivious to it and talk about, well, everything is not dealing with racism. And they are correct. Everything is not dealing with racism. But for majority of the time, it is race, because that's the foundation that this country was built off of. It was built off the concept of racism. So whether we want to acknowledge that or not. And later on today, I'm going to be talking about how the marketing, the housing marketing has devalued because due to racism. And that's been recent articles talking about these things where couples were trying to sell their homes, but they couldn't sell their homes at a price they wanted because it was devalued. But when their white counterpart was at that same location, the home value went up, and the house was worth the money that the white couple wanted to sell it for. But when the black couples came in, the house was not worth the values. So it was, the marketing went down. So yeah, so we can show proof of that today, how racism still has a full effect on people, and in certain areas, well, in most areas, especially when we talk about the housing marketing. I mean, there's articles on it. So later on, hopefully I can do a video about that, and I could show information and show proof, because maybe people will still understand that, well, dang, racism is still at full effect. Racism still has an impact on institution, especially when it comes to housing, when it comes to loan, etc. All right. Now let's go further down into this book. Let's go further down. It says, the cosign to slavery of every child born of a slave mother made slavery perpetual and ever increasing in volume. One pen flatters in any attempt to describe adequately adequately its crushing impact upon motherhood, family relationships, and the awakening spirit of youth. It exposed every female slave to abuse by members of the white race and co-signed tens of thousands of the children of white men to slavery. Miscegenation and separation of family were among its evil consequences. It says the gift to men in a nation dedicated to political democracy of extra political power as a reward for owning slaves, with power increasing in direct proportion to the number they own, created an almost unbelievably written political system that perpetuated slavery, lived on after slavery was abolished, and existed today in a nation which claims to be a classic land of liberalism. Then goes on to say the gift of complete freedom of action to all states for 20 years to import slaves from Africa in order to buy their support for a new constitution was a public admission of national weakness of great magnitude. It sacrificed the national interest to selectional greed. It gave to the power, yet it gave to the pro-slavery extremists an undue sense of power and readiness to make further extreme demands. The public confession by Congress that it had no power over slavery in the states was not binding upon future Congress, but it influenced the determination of public policy for a long time. As a constitutional interpretation, it was neither in accord with all the facts nor worthy of men engaged in implementing the fundamental law. The grant of power to slaveholders to roam the country, seizing Negroes to carry home as alleged fugitives, was an open invitation to kidnapping. There was precious little differences between the pursuit of fleeing men in Africa and in the United States. None whatever between the fox hunt and the slave hunt, and none between the enslavement of a free person in Africa and in a free state of the United States. And then number 7, it says the admission of Kentucky as a slave state was both a betrayal and a precedent. If there ever had been an intention to admit any more slave states into the Union, it was not made clear to the opponents of slavery in the convention, and was not so understood by the ratifying conventions of states then in process of emancipation. So check this out. It says, admission of a slave state was a betrayal of the free states which ratified. States which had claimed the right to import slaves now claim the right to demand the continuation of slavery in the states to be formed from lands to which they surrendered claims, however ephemeral their claims may have been. So this was not the end. It was only the beginning. These things had been done when men were opening a new continent and were desperately in need of labor. When the government in England was strongly supporting the slave trade, when the founding fathers were hard pressed to frame and secure the adoption of a stronger instrument of government in the face of external danger, when emancipation was in progress, and when economic conditions were unfavorable to slavery, there was every reason to suppose it would quickly disappear. The Constitution, however, gave Congress power to confine slavery to the original slave states, power it failed to use. Instead, it passed the Fugitive Slave Act and admitted a new slave state. Congress did these things at the very time drastic action against slavery was most needed. It did them before an increase in the profits from slave labor built up add pressure for the protection of expansion of slavery. Once that had happened, the golden opportunity to put an end to slavery by peaceful means was gone. So, technically speaking, right? Slavery ended around, let's see. So, slavery actually ended around 1803, right? That's when slavery originally ended. That's when it was outlawed. But because it continued after it was outlawed in 1803 by at the time, was it United States? Yeah, it was United States. Well, it wasn't really United States as of yet. Okay, it wasn't United States because what people don't know, that was two different America. You had United States of America and you had the Confederate States of America. So the United States of America was mostly the northern states, and the Confederate States of America was the southern states, which was also considered as the Bible Belt or the Black Belt states, right? So yeah, so it was two different United States, and then the rest of them was like unclaimed territories and all. All right. So once those territories was bought up, then some of those territories became slave states, and the rest of them just became like free states and stuff. All right, but yeah, so slavery officially really ended in 1803, but people continued to go to Africa and import more slaves, and they went to the Caribbeans, Latin America, and brought more slaves over here to America. So slavery did not officially end until after the Civil War. And that's when the Reconstruction era came about. So when the Reconstruction era came about, that's when the concept of slavery officially ended. Right? So the whole thing with the Civil War brought about the combination of what we know today as the United States. Because remember, it was the North versus the South. It was the North versus the South. And the Northerners came to the South and burnt up the cities. And one of those cities that was burnt up in the South was what we know today as Atlanta. Atlanta was burnt up completely. It was burnt to the ground. So today, if you come to Atlanta and you see a statue of a woman holding a bird, that means that the phoenix rose from ashes. So if anybody comes to Atlanta and they go downtown, go to the park, which is called Woodrow Park, there's a statue down there at the park downtown where a woman is holding the bird up, and that represents the phoenix rose from ashes, because during the Civil War, Atlanta was the city that was burnt completely down. Okay, and then when the Reconstruction era came about, that's when Atlanta started building itself back up. All right. But yes, so basically that's when slavery officially ended. So with that being said, not only are we a descendant of those who came um when slavery was put into effect and slavery was considered lawful, but we're also a descendant of those who came here, who was brought here illegally. All right. We're a descendant of those who were brought here illegally as slaves, and as well as those who were brought here when it was legal. Let's see. No, it's not going anywhere. You're right, Henry. It's not. Racism is not going anywhere. And that's what people have to understand, because this country, especially, was built on the foundation of racism, not just and the reason why it was built on the foundation of racism was due to slavery. And the reason why slavery was happening was due to capitalism. So racism came about because of slavery, and slavery came about due to the economic system that we know as capitalism. So, of course, racism is not going to disappear anytime soon, because that's the foundation of this country. Now, there are individuals who have change of heart and individuals who might see things beyond color, but on the collective scale, it's not going anywhere because that's the foundation. So once we understand that, once we study the history even more, this is why we have to pay attention to history, because history tells a story of how things were in the past and how they came about in the present. And the present is what determines the future. So the past brings about the present, and the present brings about the future. Okay? So that's why we got to study the history. We cannot just ignore history and say, well, the things was in the past, and what happened in the past, it was just the past. That's not how it works. Like, that's not how it works. That's not how thing goes. But let me go ahead and continue on. So if you guys want to look up more information about this book, this book is seen to be pretty accurate for the most part. It's called Anti-Slavery: The Crusade for Freedom in America by Dwight Lowell Dumond. And I could continue go on and on in this book, but I'm not going to do so. So it consists of 414 pages. Let me see if people can order it from Amazon. I grew up in the South. Yes, you have to study your own family history, because your own family history plays a part in this as well. Your family was affected by this. So yes, you have to study your own family history. All right, so let me see how much it is on Amazon. All right, so I'm assuming that the book is out of print because it's very expensive. Let's see. So the price they have for Amazon is pretty expensive here. Let me see. Oh. So the price here is $375. So therefore that means it has to be out of print for it to cost that much money. Yeah, so yeah, it gotta be out of print pretty much. Yeah, because the book is $375. And it says, and that's the title of the book, the one that I read. So if you guys want to look at it, you guys can go on archive.org. So just go on archive.org and you can borrow the book. But if you want to buy it from Amazon, you'll be paying $375 for it. Let's see. And it says the paperback is $232.96. Okay, and this one for the leather bound is $71.88. So yeah, so the book is pretty expensive. It's very expensive. And I don't know anybody that want to pay that much money for this kind of book, but yeah, this book is very expensive. $232, $375, and $71.88. Yeah. But that's the price they going up for. So, but anyways, thank you guys for watching, tuning in to the channel. Make sure you guys get this book by Malcolm X. If you haven't got this book, it's called On Afro-American History. So basically, it's just dealing with the excerpt. Yeah, it just basically deal with the excerpt from the speeches that he done did, and also some of the excerpt comes from his autobiography book, which is called The Autobiography of Malcolm X. But again, you'll find a lot of jewels in this book. It's a lot of information here. So this the other Malcolm that many of us don't know about and many of us never heard of. So real quick, I just want to show y'all something before I close it out. Check this out. So check this out. He say pay up. He said, you always had someone else to do your fighting for you, perhaps haven't realized it. England became powerful because she had others to fight for her. She used the African against the Asian and the Asian against the African. France used the Senegalese. All these white powers have had some little lackeys to do their fighting for them. And America has had the 22 million African Americans doing, America has had the 22 million African Americans to do your fighting for you. It was we who have fought your battles for you and have picked your cotton for you. We built this house that you're living in. It was our labor that built this house. You sat beneath the old cotton tree telling us how long to work or how hard to work, but it was our labor, our sweat, and our blood that made this country what it is. And we're the only ones who haven't benefited from it. And all we're saying today is payday retroactive. So what he's basically saying is we deserve reparation. So Malcolm been talking about reparation in this book for a long time. So he was basically saying that, look, we done built this country. We done built the houses for you. We done built your foundation. We done pitched your cottons. We done did all that. We have not been compensated for anything. And see, when African Americans say that, the descendants deserve reparation, we're getting looked at as crazy. We get looked at as crazy by not only the opposition, but we get clowned on by other black people. The ones that, especially the ones that are very conservative, we get clowned by them saying that, oh, we don't deserve no reparation because we wasn't there doing slavery. Of course we wasn't. Duh, that's not the argument. That's not the argument. Of course we wasn't there doing doing slavery, but we are a descendant of those that were enslaved. So it would make sense that if they were promised the 40 acres and the mules and they ain't really got anything from that, and when they did have some land and had some resources, it was taken away from them. It was torn down. It was burnt down. You're telling me that we don't deserve anything now, but here's the sad reality behind it. We may not get that anytime soon. We're not going to get it in our lifetime. I just don't see it happening. But the idea is still on the table. It's been talked about for years. For years. The idea is on the table, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. Especially when you have presidents in the office, it don't matter if they Democrat or Republican, they're going to put their focus on foreign policy before they put the focus on giving people reparation. I'm going to say it again. They put the focus on foreign policies before they put the focus on giving people reparation. So I don't see it ever happening anytime soon. I don't see us weeping that type of benefit. And that's something that would have to go beyond the United States, because people got to understand slavery was an international business. It was not just a United States of America business. It was a business in England. It was a business in Portugal. It was a business in Spain. It was a business in France. It was a business in South America. It was a business in Latin America. It was a business in the Caribbean. It was a business here in North America. That's the type of business it was. It was a business in Africa. So what I'm saying is that that's something that has to go into the world courts, not just United States. And then we're going to talk about the transatlantic slave trade. We also got to bring in the trans-Saharan slave trade too, because that affected, just hear me out, because some of our people was dealing with that before they encountered the transatlantic slave trade. They dealt with the trans-Saharan slave trade, especially over there in West Africa. Then you had some from East Africa, right? Well, the southern part of Africa that was sent over to places like India. Places like Pakistan, or what is known today as Pakistan. Parts of the Middle East. Again, this is something that would have to go into the world courts, not just the United States of America. Because the United States ain't got the money to be trying to give trillions and trillions of dollars to people who were slaves in this country. And if the United States did have the money, they would not be willing to give trillions of dollars. Some Black seas are underwater turns to lake. Oh, as a matter of fact, there's a lake called what's it called? Lake Lanier. In Georgia, there's a lake called Lake Lanier. And at one point in time, there used to be a city called Oscarville. Oscarville was majority black, a black city, a black population. It was a small town. And there was some discoveries that where Lake Lanier is at, there was grave sites, racetracks, homes, was it memorial centers? It was a lot of things that were discovered underneath that lake. And what's so crazy is, let me show you what's so crazy is about that is that the mayor at that time in Atlanta, his name was William Hartsfield. So Hartsfield, around 1950, gave the green light to the construction worker to build a dam. And when they built the dam, there was water traveling through the dam, and that completely wiped the city off. So some of the residents already had left town, but the rest of them, they didn't leave. So around that time period, once that dam was built, it completely wiped the whole entire city, that little small town. So now it's just Lake Lanier Island, or Lake Lanier. So it's funny that you brought that up, but that happened to be one of them. When he say, when anything is accurate, it's out of print or the price go up. Absolutely. Yeah, the price is going to go up because they trying to sell it for more than what it's really worth. They trying to get you to spend more out of pocket. They basically saying if you want it, then spend more out of pocket. So no, of course they're not going to give you a dime. No, not in this time, not in this lifetime. It's not going to happen. Yes, and that's what I'm talking about. Yes, the Arabs did play their part in the trans-Saharan slave trade. Not the transatlantic slave trade, but the trans-Saharan slave trade. They played a major part in it. Hey, peace, Chavis. How you doing? I hope everything going well with you, Chavis. Thank you for coming through. The world courts belong to them. But what I'm saying at the end of the day, that's something that has to be done on the international level, not something that's just going to be done by the United States. It's something that has to go to the international courts. Because again, slavery was not just a United States business. It was all connected. It was connected from Africa to the Caribbeans, to the United States, to South America. It was not just a North America business. And that's what people have to realize and understand. All right. So anyways, that's all I have for today. And I want to thank you guys for tuning in, watching. So with that being said, you guys have a good one. Be safe and make sure you subscribe to my channel, like my channel, hit the notification bell if you like the information that I put out here. And with that being said, y'all be safe and I'll talk to y'all pretty soon. All right. So I'll come back later with some more information. And till next time, peace and power, elevation be to all of you. Thank you.